Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of the Beards and Cars podcast, which of course you can grab in its podcast form by clicking the SoundCloud link down below. So let's try that again, shall we? Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of the Beards and Cars podcast, which you can grab down below via that SoundCloud link. Now this particular topic is a community suggested one, and it ties in interestingly with a couple of previous episodes that I've done regarding an open world game, what could be the ultimate open world game. I did an entire episode about that. It was a pretty popular one and a very well received one as well, and I believe I actually may have referenced this idea in that video, I don't recall. But as far as this concept goes, of course you saw from the title and the thumbnail, the question is, what if there were a Gran Turismo free roaming, in other words, street racing game? Should that happen? Could that happen? Would you like it to happen? There are a number of different questions all intertwined. Now, first of all, I'm going to put out my thoughts, and of course slap yours down below as well. Then we're going to get more into the kind of realistic side of things, like the can it happen, will it happen kind of stuff. So first of all, for my thoughts, would I like this to happen? And if so, what would I like to be in the game? Well, as you can kind of tell by the second question, yes, I actually would like this to happen. I think that a free roaming Gran Turismo game, Gran Turismo world, if you will, could actually be a really cool concept, because polyphony, regardless of my criticism of them, you know, as I've said before, I'm not a hater and I'm not a super fanboy either. I like to be in between. I like to commend them when they do things well and criticize them when they don't, or at least, of course, when I see things that I don't think are up to their par. But I would definitely say that when they go all in and put in a huge amount of effort into a game, there are plenty of things to like about said game. Even for GT Sport, for instance, I did an entire video way back about all the things that I liked about it, and even more recently, we discussed things that could be very much so carried over into GT7 that I would be very happy with. Now, as far as this particular idea goes, for a free roaming game, I would be very curious to see what Polyphony's take on that would be, because we've seen them venture away from the main titles before, not just with sport, which of course is close to the main titles, but at the same time very much so the online geared side of things. But in the past, we've had two much more specific ways that we've seen them stray off the path, and that is, of course, to some degree, GT PSP, which was kind of Gran Turismo 4 meets Gran Turismo 5, kind of like Gran Turismo 4.5, if you will, on, of course, the PSP, with the console change being the most significant thing about it, and a completely different career mode structure as well. But at the same time, I would say that Tourist Trophy is the most curious offshoot that they've done. Because not only is it my favourite offshoot that they've done out of the two, but also it shows that they can turn their attention to another facet of racing or driving or riding in that case, and still have an extremely competent, well-rounded approach to making it. It is very much so the Gran Turismo 4 of bike games. So if you haven't played it, even if you're not into bikes, I think the Gran Turismo side of things, that kind of vibe alone, will give you plenty to love, and it might even get you into bikes. It's actually that good of a game. Now, as far as what I think they would do with a road game, like a street racing game or a free roaming game, I would be really curious, because there are two ways that it could go. They could either go something like the Test Drive Unlimited route, where you have this really large free roaming map with full traffic and interactive, scenery, if you will, or they could go down a very different route, and that is what I would call the Forza Horizon 1 strategy, which, if you go back to the first Forza Horizon game, it's technically a free roaming map, but it's actually not, because most of the map is still cordoned off. So it's basically just an interlocking section and series of roads, which gives the illusion, to some degree, of a free roaming map. But there are very few places where you can actually go off the road in that first game. It's only in the third and fourth game, really, that you went full into literally going anywhere on the map, and that's great. But I think if Gran Turismo was going to jump into it, I could definitely see them going down that more closed-in kind of approach that Horizon 1 had, It's a similar approach to what games like some of the Need for Speeds have as well, like Carbon, for instance, or even Underground 2, where, yes, technically it's a free roam map, but everything is very clearly cordoned off. It's just loads of intersecting roads. Whereas Test Drive Unlimited, Forza Horizon 3, they're not like that. You can go straight across the road, cut through buildings, go off-road completely, go into secret areas. It's a very different experience. I definitely think Gran Turismo would go more for the Horizon 1 style. And that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing because, again, they've never done this before. And I would actually love to see it happen as well for a secondary reason. It actually ties into what I said about Tourist Trophy again, because I think that if anyone was going to make a crossover, and at this point, if anyone was qualified to make a crossover between cars and bikes again, considering how few games have done that successfully, in the racing sphere, Project Gotham and Test Drive Unlimited being probably the two standouts, really. When it comes to real vehicles, at least, I think that Gran Turismo, and more specifically Polyphony, are very qualified to do that, because Tourist Trophy is a very well-made, very competent approach to biking and riding, and of course Gran Turismo speaks for itself. So combining the physics of both, they already have similar graphics, as I said, Tourist Trophy and GT4, the physics, the graphics, the tracks, the tuning, they're all very much so grounded in the same reality. They use even similar sound effects, similar layouts, all that kind of stuff. So, of course, back then, I could definitely see it happening. Now, we are very far removed from that. When did Tourist Trophy come out? Like 2006, I think? So we are well past that. So at this point, it would be more like something where GT Sport meets Tourist Trophy 2, in effect. And of course, Tourist Trophy 2 is in itself an entire conversation that we've had in a previous episode of this same series as well. And again, one which I definitely enjoyed making. Now, that is, I think, the overview of my personal thoughts. I would love it to happen. I think that they definitely have the capability, the qualifications, and the past track record to make something like that work. Even if it didn't have bikes in it, I would of course love that. But even if it didn't, if it was just Gran Turismo World, for instance, I think they could definitely make it work. They could make it work very well. I know a ton of people would love to have the kind of access to all the JDM models that we have in Gran Turismo. Again, especially if you were talking like GT4 through 6. If you imagine, for instance, all of those vehicles on the street, on like a Forza Horizon 1 layout. Now, the curious thing to me would be, if they did a Gran Turismo World, where would it be? I think that would be interesting, because we know that Gran Turismo puts a lot of effort into like the expansive nature of the tracks, especially the previous games where you had loads of different circuits and loads of different variations. So I feel that if they did do a map, it would probably be quite large. Now, where they would set it, I think would be very curious, because Polyphony have always kind of favoured two areas in particular, America and Japan. And for those who don't know, I believe, unless I'm mistaken, but from what I've heard, Japanese people tend to have quite a lot of love for American culture, and Americans also have quite a lot of love for Japanese culture, so it's not too surprising that Polyphony would have kind of a bleed over there. And if that were indeed the case, I could fully see them implementing something like an American location, maybe even like a New York or something like that. But I think that brings us to the more curious side of the discussion, which is, could something like that happen? And probably more pertinently, will it? Because those are two very different questions. You could do a lot of things. As we said, they're certainly capable of doing it, they're qualified of doing it, they've dipped their toe into other stuff, like Forza did with Horizon, they did with Tourist Trophy, so they're certainly capable of it, there's no question about that. The question of will they, though, that is a much more important one. And unfortunately for those who are on the bandwagon, if you will, of liking this idea as much as I do, I don't think it will. And the curious thing about that for me is that the reason why I don't think it will, the primary reason at least, is because of when we are. And what I mean by that is, look at GT Sport. Its focus is totally different, as we've discussed before. Kaz is fully in love with the FIA integration, with the online stuff. Again, as we've discussed before, that has no place in an open world game. Certainly not in a street racing game, especially with Toyota recently saying that they don't want their cars in street racing games, so in all likelihood you wouldn't even have Toyota in the game necessarily. So I would say that, to summarise that idea of why I don't think it will happen, I think it's simply a case of Kaz's mind isn't in that place anymore. I think that if it was going to happen, it would have already. And that's kind of a disappointing attitude to have, but that's what I'm calling the realistic side of things, because back around 2006, we had Tourist Trophy. Around a similar time, I think, we had the PSP game, maybe a little bit later. So that was the time when they were experimenting. And although the games didn't do badly, they certainly weren't main games in terms of success. Tourist Trophy is more of a cult favourite, and the PSP game, of course, isn't going to appeal to as many as a PS2 will, or a PS3, by definition. So when you combine that with the fact that clearly his mind is very much so in the professional side of gaming, I just don't see that happening. I think, like I said, if it was going to, it would have probably happened about 10 years ago, maybe somewhere around Gran Turismo 5, because Gran Turismo 5 actually would have arguably been the perfect time, because they updated the graphics significantly, they had the most cars they'd ever had in a game to that point, it was on a brand new console. That is prime time for making an offshoot game like a Gran Turismo World. Even if it didn't have bikes, it wouldn't even need that. Even if you just made like Gran Turismo 5 but with an open world map instead, that would have been the time to do it. And of course, they didn't. So, in all honesty, as much as I would love it to happen, I just don't think it ever will. And the only time that I think I would reevaluate that, in fact, there are two times. One is if they announced it, because of course, by definition, that would make me rethink it. But also, the second thing would be if the trajectory and the focus of Polyphony changed from what it currently is. And we all know that is not happening anytime soon. The next game will still have a lot of that focus in there, be it a GT Sport 2 or a GT7, depends on what Kaz feels like saying this week, but that is the current trajectory, and as long as that is the case, I just don't think it's going to happen. And I would say that's actually kind of an unfortunate thing, because even though many of us might not play it, I think a ton of people would. And I'm not just talking about existing fans, and this I'm talking about now is from a business perspective. And that is, look at what the Horizon series has done for Forza. It's arguably bigger at this point, in terms of how much content gets released, how much the game continues to get pushed by Turn 10, how much expansion it's given. Forza 5, 6, and 7 aren't bad, but Horizon 2, 3, and 4 went from strength to strength. Now, number 3 is still my favourite, but I could certainly understand why 4 would appeal to many people. And to me, Horizon has kind of taken over the Forza series. So imagine if Gran Turismo dipped their toe into that similar field. I think that would actually be a brilliant idea, not just because I want to see it, but because it would be just a very smart business move. Because look at how many successful racing games there are out there. Consider some, for instance. Consider the circuit racing games. You've got Forza, Gran Turismo, Project Cars, AC, and some others. Now consider the street racing side of things. Midnight Club, Test Drive Unlimited, Need for Speed. Very successful games, especially the Midnight Clubs and the Need for Speeds. Now, if Gran Turismo even dipped their toe into that area, even if the game wasn't necessarily as good as some of those other street racing ones which have been doing it for years, if not decades in some cases, it would still be more than worth their while because of the amount of people who would buy it. But of course, most of that is irrelevant anyway because it's just my thoughts. It's not like they're actually going to do it. Overall though, I would love it to happen. I don't think it ever will. Realistically, I said about the two variables, but I don't think it will. That's my official stance. I do not predict a street racing Gran Turismo game anytime soon. And if that were to happen, I think most likely a similar thing to the Forza Horizon 1 game would probably happen, where if I recall correctly, I think a different studio or a different team actually made the game, or at least part of it. So I could kind of see that happening with Polyphony, like a different team does it, but then it has their name on it. I could see that happening to some degree, but again, I just don't even know if they would want their brand on that. I don't know if they'd want their focus drawn off onto that at any time soon. And like I said, with Toyota, maybe even other brands too, you don't even know if they would want to be a part of it. So there are a lot of variables to consider. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, I would love to hear yours down below, and one of the best things I think about an open world Gran Turismo game would be some of the rallying that could be done, because a lot of players loved the rallying in Gran Turismo, and imagine that but on a much larger scale. That could be a lot of fun. But overall, as I said, that's it for my thoughts. Slap yours down below. grab the audio version from SoundCloud down below if you want to listen to it in that form. And of course, as always, do all the good stuff like join in the Discord server to get in on the conversation. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.